So if everyone would please bear with me. I planned on continuing a lesson that we started together a couple of weeks ago, which I've done on Tuesdays with the male class. But I was feeling a little bit creative tonight. And I was thinking maybe I would do a class like I used to do. When I first started teaching, I actually used to take an hour before the class and kind of, I don't know, in creative writing, when things just pop into your head, you just take it and then you write it down. And then based on whatever I wrote or whatever came into my mind, I would then have another idea that I attached to that idea. And then I kept doing that for like an hour's long class. Some of the guys here, probably Benny was the only one here right now who was there for those classes. Those were really good classes, thank God. And they were very wild because of my crazy mind. But recently, over the past few years, I kind of have been more in the text. I was thinking tonight, though, to get a little creative and try it again. Except this time, I didn't have the time that I had a few years ago, since I have a family now, which I didn't have as much of a family then. Thank God, Baruch Hashem. So I don't have as much time now. But so what's the reason for this whole preface? I didn't create the whole class yet. So Bezrat Hashem, I'm going to create it as the class goes on. And hopefully, Bezrat Hashem, something good will come from it. But I have a basic idea I want to speak about. Something that's very, very important and essential. Something which everybody is affected by and connected to. Something which everybody needs improvement on. And any improvement in this area brings the most blessing of all areas that you could focus on. So the inspiration for this class comes from last week's Parsha. We finished the first book of the Torah, which is Sefer Bereshit. Now, if anybody knows that everything in the Torah works in a way that's very interesting. Every book itself, from the beginning until the end, is reflective also from the beginning till the end of existence. And despite the fact that the books are so different, if you look closely, you'll see a lot of similarities if you understand that. Like, for instance, if you look at Bereshit, you'll notice that in the beginning there was tohu vavohu, there was darkness, and then there was a light that shone, that was very bright. Hashem then took that light away, hid it, for later on. Okay? Does anybody know in this Parsha, which is coming up now, in the beginning of Sefer Shemot, how Shemot starts? So you see, in fact, something very similar. You see all of a sudden there's Tov Vavohu that starts. That Paro forgets who Yosef is. The Jewish people are put into slavery. And all of a sudden there's a little boy who's born, who the Midrash says that he filled up the house with light when he was born. And then what happened to Moshe? Does anybody know? They took him and they put him in a teva. They put him in a little tiny basket. Good. And they hid him away. Does anybody remember how Bereshit started? There was a light that was created after there was chaos in the world. That light was very intense. It shone in the world for a second, and then it was hid away for the tzaddikim in the future. Who is that light? What is that light? That light is Moshe. So you see that in the beginning of Bereshit, which is very abstract and it's speaking about creation, you see in the second book of the Torah it becomes more physical and concrete. That the same exact paradigm, the same exact situation is taking place, not in terms of creation and the constellations and the universe, but specifically amongst a group of people who went down into exile to suffer the worst suffering in history, and yet there was a light that was hidden there before the suffering started. Does everybody see the parallel? You see the connection? Okay. Now, the end of this book, you see Yaakov Avinu, he gathers his sons around and he gives each of them a bracha. Some of them, interestingly, actually sound like curses. But we know, especially according to Chassidut, that everything in the Torah is a bracha. Even if it looks bad, it's really camouflaged or disguised good. Now, you'll see towards the end, who are the last two brothers to get blessed? It was Yaakov's two favorites, the ones he loved the most, the ones who came from his primary wife, Rachel, the one who he truly wanted to marry. And that was his firstborn from that relationship. That was Yosef. And then there was Benjamin. Okay? Yosef, you'll notice when it gets to his bracha, it's way longer than everybody else's bracha. Like to Shimon and Levi, he's like, what's wrong with you guys? Boom, next to Yehuda. And then he gets to Yosef. And he's like, wow, you're amazing. You're the rosh, you're the head. All blessings going to come to you. Da, 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 da. It's sentences and sentences and sentences and sentences. And then he says that Benjamin's a predator. Okay? So if anybody knows any Benjamins around, and that sounds familiar for you, you should know it's not that person's fault. It's from the Torah. Okay? It's sourced in spiritual reality. You can't do anything about it. It's just a joke. Okay. So one part that I want to focus on, and Sephardim all know this by heart, because you guys will spend thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of dollars to get this aliyah. Do you know why? Because Yaakov told Yosef, you are Ben Porat Yosef. What does Ben Porat Yosef mean? Why do people so connect to this that when the aliyah comes up, they need to get it? That I'm willing even not to come to shul all year, but I'm going to come for that weekend and I'm going to get that aliyah. Anybody know? Is there anything which you know Sephardim are very nervous about? Ayin hara, very good. What is the antidote to the ayin hara? Ben Porat Yosef. It's actually connected to that. It said about Yosef at Tzaddik, Ben Porat Yosef, alai ayin. He was, literally, it means he rested on the well, or that's what it seems to mean. But if you look at the words, alei ayin, it means on top of the eye. What does it mean on top of the eye? He's not affected by the eye. He's above it. So what we're going to learn in tonight's class, why was Yosef above the eye? Meaning he was not affected by the way that other people perceived him, even though it might be negative. And in fact, he had the most negative perception of him. But he, in the end, was matzliach and successful, and nothing stopped him. Not spiritually, not physically, not materially, not in any way. Right? His hatred and the people around him, those who were trying to make him suffer, that increased more and more as he was getting older and older. It started intense and it continued to get more and more intense. And yet, he was like a bulldozer. Everything he went through, he was matzliach. It didn't make a difference. And this is the reason people so connect to him. Because why? He was an ish matzliach. It literally said about him that Hashem was with him, he was matzliach. It said it multiple times about Yosef. Everything that he did worked, despite his difficult circumstances. Okay. So now I want to explain in a deeper way, what is it about Yosef that makes him successful? And with this, every single one of us, no matter what's going on in our lives, we can have a goal to shoot for. And we can also know why it is working this way, that it helps so much, this thing we're going to speak about. And we're also going to look at a different understanding of what does it mean above the eye. What does Ben Porat mean? They translate it in Art Scroll as a fruitful bow. Does anybody here know what that means? A fruitful bow. Doesn't sound so masculine. What do you think? A bowl of fruits. It was not a bowl, it was a bow. But the main point is, the bow is a well. He's like a fruitful well. Okay? What does it mean literally? The word porat comes from the word pur, like purvu. The first mitzvah in the Torah is to be fruitful, to expand, to increase, to multiply. Very first mitzvah in the whole Torah. Yosef's whole entire essence was that he was fruitful. Everything that he did worked and gave birth to fruit, both spiritually and physically. Now, I want to show you that, in fact, it doesn't just mean that he was above the eye, meaning ayin hara. It means he was above the eye which represents consciousness of this world. When you think about this world, what is perception referred to in the Torah? Seeing. Yosef was above seeing. What does that mean? He saw the world not at the level that we see it down here. He was able to see through limited reality. He was able to see through physicality, and he was able to understand very, very, very deep things. According to Kabbalah, in some ways, he was the smartest, wisest person that ever lived. What was it about him that made it so smart? On paper, it shouldn't have been that way. Why? Because at 17 years old, he was abducted and sold as a slave. If you want to be the smartest person in America, you're going to have to go to the best schools. You're going to have to go to the best college. You're going to have to get a high-level education, come out of school in your 30s with $100,000 or hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of debt, and then you have achieved this very high level of intellect. But Yosef, despite his lack of education, was the wisest of all his brothers. Why? What made him above the eye, meaning above this world, that he could see beyond his circumstances? Where do we even see that there's a proof for this? From the very beginning of Yosef's existence in the Torah, he's 17 years old. Rav Natan says, why is it saying he's 17? Because it's Gematria Tov, to allude to the fact that he was good. What does it mean? Okay, great. All the tzaddikim were good. So Rav Natan says, no, he was only good. There was nothing bad about him. There was no lacking within him. And this is actually the deeper reason of why his brothers did not understand him. They thought that he was threatening because he was different than them. In fact, he was only threatening because he was the only one that had no lacking amongst them. And therefore, when they saw him, they all saw their own lackings. And then he was made out to be enemy number one. And he had dreams. What type of dreams did he have? About the future. Those dreams did come true, all of them. So you see from the very beginning, he had nevuah. He had prophecy. Later on, you see as well, he's in the jail cell in very horrible, difficult circumstances when most of us, our minds would be in bilbul, and he's interpreting dreams correctly. Then he comes out of jail. He's with Paro in a situation that you're literally with the most powerful man in the whole world at that point. And he has a lot on the line that if he can seemingly figure out this person's dream or that he's happy with it, he might get out of jail. That's a lot of pressure. If you can imagine being in that situation, just from the pressure itself, you probably wouldn't be able to function or come out with a good conclusion. And in fact, Yosef was the only interpreter, despite the fact that Paro went to all of his interpreters, that not only was he happy with that interpretation, but it ended up coming true exactly. And later on, you see as well that there is a huge famine. And what ends up happening? Yosef has a crazy idea. Let's get all of the money in the world. Let's find out and figure out a financial plan in which we will be the hub of all of sustenance. We will collect all of it since we know the famine's coming. Then people will not have sustenance. Where are they going to go to get food? They're going to starve. So what are they going to have to do? They're going to have to come to us. Who specifically did they have to come to? Yosef. So Yosef made an ingenious plan that everybody in the world, if they wanted to eat and survive, would have to come to him. When did he become a Times financial guru? When did he go to that stock market class? How is he figuring out everything? On the dot, everything. And what ended up happening? Exactly that. Literally, people came from all around the world to Egypt to get their food. Egypt in the time became the world power, like America has been in the past, and we'll see what happens in the future. All because of Yosef's wisdom. Where was he getting all this wisdom from? I didn't see anywhere that he was going to yeshiva while he was getting beaten and abused and subjugated and oppressed. And yet seemingly, he has this level of consciousness, of wisdom, which goes completely above his circumstances. How many of us watch motivational speeches? How many of us go to different classes or seminars? How many of us pay thousands of dollars or hundreds of dollars for different types of classes or wisdoms that we think are going to help us? And yet, if you need anything, you could really just go to Yosef, who is not trained in any of these things, and he would give it to you on the money. Where is his koach to do that? So now I want to explain something. In Kabbalah, which is the hidden esoteric wisdom of Torah, it's explained that when Hashem created the universe, he didn't create him himself. Because if he would have created it himself, then there would be no way that we would be able to experience the world, because it's too intense. Just as like a mashal, let's say, for instance, you took all of the light of the sun and you wanted to plug it into the outlet over here. What would happen to the outlet? Anybody know? Nobody? They didn't teach that at public school. What would happen if you put the light of the sun into an outlet and you tried to stick the fan in because it's blazing hot in here right now? Okay, die. That's very fatalistic. We would probably die, but that's not what would happen to the outlet. What would happen to the outlet? It would blow up. It would fuse, whatever that means. I used to hear that in the action movies a lot. It would fuse, and then it would explode. Why? Because it's too intense for that outlet to handle. So too, it's explained in Kabbalah that if Hashem is going to create a physical world with human beings in it, and animals and wildlife and X, Y, and Z, these things are all limited and physical. He can't directly, so to speak, create everything, because then, so to speak, he is putting all of his koach into it, and then the world would not be able to hold that light. So what did Hashem do? This is a very fundamental concept in Kabbalah. He created 10 spiritual energies, 10 divine channels of influence with which he uses those 10 to create and recreate the world at every moment. Meaning simply, when you leave this class and you go home, and let's say something changes in your life, what happened that your life changed? Hashem used the 10 sfirot and he configured them in a different way to create a new happening in your life. Nothing happens in this world except through those 10 sfirot, those 10 channels. And ultimately, once Hashem's light gets through the 10 and it reaches through the bottom, the light has been diminished enough that you could stick it in the outlet and then it puts it in the fan and it's cool on your face and it feels good. Does everybody understand that a little bit? Okay. Now, the most interesting of the sfirot and the most unique of the sfirot is the second to last one. This is called Yesod. Yesod literally means foundation. Who in the Torah was the physical manifestation of that spiritual energy? We know that according to Kabbalah, that when the Torah is speaking about Abraham, Yitzchak, Yaakov, Moshe, Aaron, Yosef, and David, these were not just people, even though they were people. But actually, they are, in a very disguised way, hinting and cluing us into how do the different sfirot work. Because they are actual physical human beings, that their whole essence was one of the different sfirot. Who was the person that his whole essence and being was bound up with Yesod? Yosef. And he was the foundation. Good. Now, what is the main function of Yesod, of the foundation? What is the purpose of Yesod amongst the Sfirot? What does it do that's so unique, that's different than the other Sfirot? And with this, we'll understand why Yosef was unique. Because Yosef was a reflection of Yesod, meaning, so to speak, if you can imagine a film projector, and you have above film, and then you have down here in this world, the film being projected, right? Let's say, for instance, imagine this whole world was a screen. And all you have up there is film. Have you ever tried to look at film before? You ever go in the back of the movie theater? Not for those reasons, but for other reasons. That you look at the film, you wanted to study the film in the back, right? Monday Night Quarterback, you wanted to study the film, get ready for the game, okay? You'll notice that when you open up the film, you cannot understand it. It's not discernible. It's not readable. It's just little black screens. However, if you put it in a projector and you shine it onto a blank canvas, On the blank canvas, you will see a living reality, seemingly, a movie. Now, if you never went to the movie theater before and you were born in the woods, then when you went in there and somebody said to you, I want you to tell me where the movie is coming from, they would tell you from the blank screen. But you, being a movie junkie, you know that movie's coming from the projector. That's just a blank screen. So too, this physical world and the stories in the Torah are all the blank screen with things being projected onto it. So where is Yosef being projected from? Because Yosef is just a projection. Yesod. There is a spiritual energy called Yesod. It goes through a projector and it's shown down here through a person who happened to be very handsome, very charismatic, and very unique, because these are all functions of Yesod. What does Yesod do that's different than the other Sfirot? It's explained in Kabbalah and the Zohar and the Matok Midvash, which is a commentary on the Zohar. Yesod is the only Sfira which harnesses, unites, and gathers and collects all of the other Sfirot together within it. Everybody understand what I just said? Again, for instance, you have a Sfira called Chesed, kindness. That is Hashem's energy which creates, which is pouring, which is giving. But that's all it does. It doesn't do anything else. Does anybody know who's represented by Chesed? Did you notice that Abraham had only one thing he did? Chesed, that was it. He couldn't do anything else. Yes, but that was also within the concept of Chesed. He couldn't do anything else beside Chesed. Why? Because he is Chesed. He is the living reality, which is called the sphere of Chesed. If you want to know how the sphere of Chesed works, look at Abraham, and you'll know. Yosef was very multifaceted, though. He was very unique in all of his different abilities, in his level of success in so many different areas, and in his ability ultimately to unite and bring together all of the Jewish people, which he did. Because Yesod is the only sphera that actually doesn't just work on its own, which it has its own koach, but its koach comes from taking all of the higher sphirot, which there are 8 above it, they all pool down and channel into it. So really, Yesod is all 9 upper sphirot working as one. I know this is a little Kabbalistic. It's going to move away from that in a second, but does anybody understand a little bit what I'm saying? There's 10 sphirot. All of them work on their own. The only one that doesn't is Yesod. Yesod literally is the combination of all the ones above it. And it then just reveals itself in the Yesod. Not to get too graphic, but just to make this understood, because I see that people's eyes are rolling in the back of their head. It could be because you're tired, you had a long weekend. Could be because this class is not made properly. Could be a lot of reasons, but just please forgive me and try to be mature for a second. In the language of Kabbalah, Yesod is always referring to the sexual procreative organ. How does the male sexual procreative organ work? It literally gathers all of the energy of the male and all of his moach, all of his mind in the form of seed, and it comes together and then it releases all of it. So it literally takes every part of the male, emotionally, psychologically, physically, energetically, and it then releases it as seed, which comes from all the way up to the man's mind. This is Yesod. Yesod takes all the upper sfirot and releases it. Okay? Now you're going to say, what does that have to do with Yosef? It doesn't seem like that's what he's doing in his life. But you'll notice what keeps happening in Yosef's life. He's giving eitzah, he's giving advice constantly. And it works, it's right. Everything he says is true. Now Rabbi Nachman explains in the 7th Torah of Likutei Moharan, Bezrat Hashem we'll get to soon, that advice is like sexual union. Why is that? Because let's say, for instance, Ellie comes to me after class. And Ellie says to me, hey, David, you know, I'm really struggling with this thing. But he comes to me, he doesn't come to anybody else. And I give him an eitzah, a very specific eitzah. What's going to happen to Ellie now? First of all, he came to me because he believes in me. That's why he's asking me. So now he's either going to carry out the advice that I give him, or it's at the very least going to affect him and be in his mind whether or not he follows through with it or not. What does Rabbi Nachman say that's like? It's like I'm giving him seed. Just like when a male gives a woman seed, and that seed ends up cultivating and turning into a child, so too when a person gives you advice, that advice is like seed. And that seed ultimately is going to give birth in your life. Why? Because if Eli's going to carry out my advice, then he gave birth to a child that came from my seed. Does everybody understand that? So what was Joseph doing to everybody? He was impregnating them. With his mind, with his ideas, with his consciousness. This is the whole entire function of Yesod. Does anybody know why Rabbi Nachman is called the Tzaddik Yesod Olam? Oh my gosh, Benny. Why is he called the Tzaddik Yesod Olam? Does anybody notice that there's a whole book called Likutei Eitzot? Rabbi Nachman told Rav Natan to take all of Rabbi Nachman's teachings and come out with all the practical advice that comes from his teachings. And there is a lot of it. And it talks about everything. How did he have advice on every topic? Literally. Finances, sexuality, psychology, depression, anxiety, kindness, Torah, prayer, literally anything you can think of, he has advice on it. Where did he get that advice from? And why is it that when you do it, you're going to see every single thing he says works? Oh, because he's just sowed. Because he's like Yosef. Now, what happens when you take the eitzah and you live with it? Then you give birth to that seed. Now, what happens if you hear advice from Rabbi Nachman, let's say to do an hour of hipodadut, let's say to remove yourself from secular wisdom, let's say that you should try and make yourself happy all the time, even if your life sucks, and you should try as hard as you can to make it that you're happy, even if your circumstances would dictate that naturally you should be in your bed depressed. When you live with it, you give the tzaddik the koach to impregnate you with his power. And that power collects and pulls in from all of the higher spiritual energies. This is the reason why those people who receive the most from Rabbi Nachman are not the ones who dance on top of cars. They are not the ones who have their tefillin bag with the fire sign. The ones who receive the most from Rabbi Nachman are the ones who do what he says. Why? Because his eitzah is seed. And Rabbi Nachman says, where is that seed coming from? He says Har Sinai. In the language of Kabbalah, it's explained that Har Sinai, which was the greatest revelation of godliness in history, actually alludes to the revelation of the higher sfirot that are above this world. Keter Chochmah Bina Da, which we haven't had since then, but we'll only have when Mashiach comes. Rabbi Nachman says, where does the eitzah of the tzaddik come from? It comes from Har Sinai. Now, if you wonder to yourself, how could it possibly make sense for me to do any of the things that Rabbi Nachman suggests? They seem to be unusual. They seem to be not normative. They seem to be too much. They're not according to me. They're not according to what anybody else teaches me to do. Why are they so not understandable? Because those pieces of advice do not come from this world. They come from Har Sinai. This all comes from the fact that the tzaddik who gets to this level, or Yosef himself, who was the paradigm for this, he doesn't just collect all the sfirot which are above him. He's also the only sphira that goes and elevates up to what's called consciousness that's above this world. What do we say in the beginning? That he's Ben Parat Yosef, Ben Parat Alay Ayin. He's above the eye. So we know in Kabbalah that the eye represents consciousness. What does it mean he's above the eye? It means he is above the consciousness of this world. He elevates the consciousness, which is Hashem, so to speak. The Yesod is the only one that does this. None of the other Sfirot go up. Yesod is the only one that actually doesn't just take everything that it has. Once it takes everything from above it, it then reaches up even higher than those things. And it gets to the highest point, it receives from there and goes back down. So what is the main function of Yesod? It is to gather and unite. What did Yosef tell his brothers? Every one of you are going to come to me. And they all thought that he was trying to assert his ego, his dominance, his rulership. But what was he explaining? I'm the Yesod. What's going to happen is all the Jewish people are going to gather to me. Why? Because the function of a Yesod is he's a magnet. He attracts every single spark of godliness to himself. And we know that the Jewish people are kulo tzaddikim. All of the sparks of godliness are within the Jews. So who has to come to Yosef? Everybody. You'll notice what ended up happening to Yosef at the end of his life. Every single Jew in the world came to him. And that was what he was trying to tell them. But what's the issue? Because he's so different from his brothers, that when he explains this, they take this as a threat. And in truth, it's the greatest thing that can happen. Do you know why? Because all godliness is only revealed in the world through unity. The greatest cause of blemish or obstacle or obstruction of good in the world comes from machloket. It comes from separation. But the function of Yosef or Yesod is to unite opposites. So for instance, and this is a little bit interesting, let's say you go on a date with somebody and you guys are connecting, right? You went on a few dates before this. This guy was boring. This guy never took a tissue and wiped his nose with it. Then finally I get a good guy. He comes in, he looks good, he sounds good, he's interesting, he's got a charismatic personality, and we start jiving and connecting. When you're jiving and connecting, that's actually a nace, that's a miracle. You know why that's a miracle? Because men and women are opposites. Now, we never think about this. Why? Because every TV show, every movie, every song, everything has to do with the union of man and woman. But according to Kabbalah and the Torah, the union of man and woman is a nace. It's a miracle. It doesn't make any sense. Because men and women think different, act different, feel different. The list goes on and on and on. And spiritually, what's the reason? It's not because of any type of sexual oppressive ideas. It has to do with the fact that Kabbalistically, men and women literally come from different parts of the spiritual world. They are drawn from different places, completely opposite places. That's the reason sometimes you will say something to the guy, you'll think it's funny, he'll sit looking at you like, what happened? And the opposite as well, he'll make a joke and he'll have worked on it for 10 minutes, and the girl will be literally sitting there and fake laughing, and then he gets hurt, and then he's like, why don't you ever laugh at my jokes? She says, oh, sorry, I just didn't get it, and she's thinking, because you're not funny. But the real reason is because he's a man and she's a woman, that's it. So how do we connect? Yesod. There is a spiritual energy which connects us, which connects and unites opposites. That is called Yesod. Anytime you connect with anybody, even of the same sex, let's say you, for instance, are very intellectual, and you all of a sudden go to a town where they're very simple. Where is your meeting place? You're thinking about crazy academic things. This guy's thinking about how he's going to tie his shoes. So how am I going to connect? Yesod. Anytime you connect with anything, it's with Yesod. What's the reason Yosef ultimately was able to connect to everybody? Because he's the Yesod. Okay? What does Yosef's name literally mean? To gather. Yosef comes from the word asaf, that means to gather. So his name literally means to gather or unite opposites. What is the physical manifestation of Yesod in the world? Anybody know? What is the physical manifestation in the world? Not in a person, but in the world. Is there any place in the world that's called the yesod of the world? I hear everybody mumbling under their breath. I'm not sure if that's how, in school, the kid, like he doesn't want to look stupid, but he doesn't have the answer. So he goes, what'd you say? Oh, nothing. Sorry. It's just, Yerushalayim. It's called the city of beauty, but it's actually not Yerushalayim itself, which is connected to Malchut, but there's a part within Yerushalayim. It's called Sion. Okay? It's called Sion. What does that mean? Sion literally means a monument. What is the monument or special mark of the Jewish people? The Beit HaMikdash. The Beit HaMikdash. And we know what happened to the Beit HaMikdash. It was destroyed. And it was razed. Not razed, R-I-S-E-D, but R-A-Z-E-D. It was destroyed, right? And in the beginning, it was the most beautiful place in the world. And all the Jewish people from all over came to it. It gathered everybody in. And it gave them revelations of godliness they never had before. And then all of a sudden, because the Jewish people, for whatever reason, we had certain lackings, then the Beit HaMikdash was destroyed. What happened to Yosef? His brothers sold him into slavery. Why? Baseless hatred. Sinan Chinam. Why was the Beit HaMikdash destroyed? Sinan Chinam. Yosef is the physical Beit HaMikdash. Everything that happened to Yosef, the Midrash said, happened to Tzion. And just like Yosef is in exile, the Beit HaMikdash is in exile, and we're mourning for it to be rebuilt. Rabbi Nachman says, what are you really mourning for? The tzaddik emet. You're mourning to unite and find the true tzaddik in your life, because that is the place of all revelation of godliness. And in the end, we all have to get to the Beit HaMikdash to go to it, just like we all have to get to the tzaddik to find it. Okay? And its koach is to unite and to give forth fruit. Now, what is it, and this is the practical part of the class, what is it that allows Yesod or Yosef to have such tremendous wisdom? What is it that allows him to see through the terrible conditions of his life and to realize that everything is actually good? Like he told his brothers, don't be upset, it's just Hashem. They're all looking at each other like, what are you talking about? You see what just happened for the past 20 years? It's crazy. Yosef said, don't think about it, just go home, everything's fine. Was he a hippie? Huh? Hippie liberal? Yosef? You guys love those guys, no? Fits well with the religious paradigm over here. Anybody know? His emunah, very good, his emunah. Where did he get his emunah from? You're onto something. Okay, very good. Yes, he got it from Hashem. And what did he do that allowed his emunah to grow to the extent that he got it from Hashem? We're doing good. Oh, Mike from New York. Shmir with the Brit. Now that's a curveball, no? What does Shmir with the Brit have to do with anything? Okay, so now we have to understand. Let's go to my student's favorite story, Adam and Eve. Let's go back to Adam and Chava for a second. Does anybody know? By the way, this will be funny if we're doing this at like 80 years old and you're like, then you get Avram in the bag and does something, Ellie comes in. That would be really sweet, Zot Hashem. That would be a dream of mine. Okay, yeah. So now what happens? Adam and Chava, Adam saw from one end of the world to the other. And then he stopped doing that. Why did he stop doing that? Because he ate from the tree. Okay, great. Now, we need to understand that according to Kabbalah, eating, and Rabbi Nachman speaks about this, is a euphemism for sexual union. What does it mean they ate from the tree? It means that he blemished his Brit. It means that he had the first error in his history in the area of sexuality. And what ended up happening is he became very conscientious and aware of his physical surroundings and the fact that he didn't have clothes, where he was sitting, that Hashem wasn't with him. Whereas before that, he's like, Ani lo mevin. Yeah, he's good. He's just walking around. He's great. He's happy. He's living the life. Him and his wife are so excited to be together. Everything is Gan Eden. And in one moment, I'm not going to. I'd have to change my last name and NOV to say that. But we see that what's the whole point? What's the whole point? He lost his ability to see beyond his life. He lost his ability to see above and beyond. How many of us get bogged down by our circumstance in our life every day? The greatest source of our suffering is not even the events themselves. It's the fact that we cannot see above them. We can't see. What is it that allows Yosef to see? Because he is the complete tikkun for Adam in the area of the Brit. What happened to Yosef? He also had a beautiful woman. This woman actually was much more intense than his wife, and she was much more proactive than his wife. And that was that she tried to entice him to be with her for a whole year. And this was in the midst of him being a slave, enslaved, after his brothers put him into a pit, after he was sold into slavery. So his whole world and life spirals out. So if you can imagine yourself, that when your whole life spirals out, you stop doing anything that's good for you. And you start engaging in every single type of negative or damaging behavior. And he's sitting there and he has a beautiful girl who every day is seducing him. Yosef happened to be quite good looking and handsome. And now what ended up happening? And also he's the Yesod, so he's going to attract whatever girl is in there. And now at the end of the year, what ends up happening? He never does it. And he runs out of there. And then he ended up being able to see what? Everything. He could see everything. The Torah said that he went chutza. It literally means that he ran out of her house. In Kabbalah, it's explained, it means he went chutza, he left this physical world. His consciousness left this lower world. Because the Torah teaches, and it's hinted to by the fact that we have our Brit on the 8th day. Why is the Brit on the 8th day? Because 8 represents above nature. There's 7 days in the week. There's 7 musical notes. There are 7 colors in the spectrum. 7, 7, 7, 7. And why? Because 7 represents the perfection of the physical world. But we have a Brit on the 8th day. Why? Because the Torah is teaching you, and Hashem is teaching you, that you have a special ability as a Jew, that if you're able to achieve what's called perfection or completion or wholeness in the area of sexuality, according to the Torah, then you achieve a state of 8, above nature. That what you experience and what you see in your life is above what you see. That what you think is above what people think. That what you feel is above what people feel. That you all of a sudden have very good advice for yourself and for others, whereas you didn't have before. That you're able to do things and be successful in ways you weren't before. All of this has to do with sexuality. Why? Because this was the very first error. What ended up happening after that error? Then it said that there was this flaming sword, and it separated Adam and Chava from the garden. What is this referring to? So it's explaining that after that happened, now forever, the greatest difficulty for humanity is going to be in the area of sexuality. And to get back into the garden, meaning to get back into that state that I am in consciousness, which is above this world, that I'm not suffering anymore from my circumstances, that I'm happy no matter what's going on, that I have good advice for myself and for others, that I'm able to be matzliach in business and at work and whatever I'm doing. Now it's going to be hard to get back in because you have that sword. And whose sword is that? Who has the weapon of the sword? Esav. And what is Esav's whole entire efforts? To get you to replay that first error in your life. This is the reason why when this area is not as it could be, you feel that you're out of control. You feel that your life is spiraling. Because the whole concept of sexuality is it's supposed to unite. It's supposed to bring things together. It's supposed to make peace. However, when it's not used in the way that Hashem says we should, then it does the opposite. And it distances you from others. And it distances your mind from your heart. And it distances your mind and your heart from your body. It distances what you want to do versus what you actually do. Your dreams versus your reality. Yesod is what unites heaven and earth. It's what unites spirituality and physicality. This is all the area of Yosef, of Yesod. For this reason, he is the fruitful bow. Everything he does gives birth to fruit. Why? Because he's above the eye. He has achieved above consciousness because of his mastery in the area of sexuality. Now, if you'll notice, what is the one thing you will see when you go outside? Especially, let's say, I don't know, if you happen to live in New York. So you go into Manhattan and you look around a little bit. What are you going to see?
Close stores. Boarded up stores.
Oh my gosh, you guys are very pure in this area, I guess. Thank God. He's like toy stores. Okay. All clothes stores, sorry. Toy stores is also good. So you will see the male and female anatomy very, very, very exposed everywhere. What happens when you go and you watch even like let's say a Parv TV show? What's going to happen? You're going to have a commercial of something very, very, very provocative. Unusually so for a children's show. And the list goes on and on. There is nowhere to look that you will not be connecting and uniting with this dynamic, this paradigm. Rabbi Nachman said that there's a wave of atheism which is going to come flood the world. Now we know that right after Rabbi Nachman passed away, 20 years later was the beginning of, so to speak, that movement that was removing Jewish people from Jewish education and bringing them into secular wisdom. Okay? And as a result of that, and as time went on and on and on, the majority of Jewish people lost their connection to believing in Hashem, even though every Jew in their essence really does believe. It's covered over with a lot of secular wisdom. How did Rabbi Nachman know that this flood of atheism was going to spread over the world? And now if you say, what type of chiddush is that? It's not such a big deal. Obviously, you look around, it's not so hard to believe that people don't believe. However, 200 years ago, that would be a complete novelty in thinking because the majority of the world believes in God at that point. So how did he know? And it connects to with what one of the students said. And that is that your emunah is completely interdependent on your level of mastery in the area of sexuality. To the degree in which you achieve mastery in this area of sexuality, according to the Torah, to that degree you will have emunah. So what did Rabbi Nachman actually see coming that he knew that atheism was going to flood into the world? And by the way, you should know atheism doesn't just mean the guy who's wearing a multicolored shirt and he's coming outside and he's, rallying everybody to come together in multiple ways. The atheist is also the part of you inside your own heart that doesn't really believe that your prayers are going to get answered. Atheism is also the part of you that when you come to pray and talk to Hashem, you can't pay attention. Why? Because what's really the point? Is he really going to do something for me? That when I learn Torah and I'm thinking to myself, I should really be out doing something else. The part of me that doesn't really believe Hashem is taking care of me, that he loves me, that he believes in me, that he wants the best for me, that everything is going to work out. That's all a pagam and emunah. So where is that all coming from? One thing, a breaking in the area of the yesod. These things are two completely interdependent realities. So for us to be able to achieve emunah, to know that everything comes from Hashem is for the best in order to bring us closer to him. For us to be what's called an ish matzliach, successful in areas of spirituality and physicality, in order for us to unite ourselves and not have tohu vavohu, chaos within us, we need to have this agent which brings everything together. Like if you can imagine in a food, let's say in this food, all the ingredients exist separate from each other. And there's one ingredient you put in and all of a sudden everything just comes together and becomes one whole. This is what Yesod does. This is what sexual mastery does according to the Torah. So Bezrat Hashem, we should all become fruitful bows and above the eye. And I know that this class was a wee bit esoteric, but the main point I want to come to is that nobody has a greater challenge than we do in history in this area. And not even just for men, for women now also, where that is also a novelty. And how big is this challenge? That you don't just deal with it yourself personally, it's everywhere all the time. So if you're wondering to yourself, why is it so hard for me to feel good about my life? Why is it so hard for me to be successful? Why is it so hard for me to feel peace? Why is so hard X, da, 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 da. And the reason is actually very clear, because you're constantly being threatened in this area by all levels of society, including yourself. The only way out is Yosef. By coming to Yosef, you will also be able to achieve mastery in this area as well. Yosef, in this sense, is the tzaddik of the generation who is comparable to Yosef. Anybody have any questions from tonight's lesson? By the way, just as a last little kicker, you'll notice, what is the mitzvah which is supposed to give you protection as a Jewish male? Tzitzit. Tzitzit. Does anybody know what the root word in tzitzit is? That's a letter. That's good. Tzadik, and what else? Tzit. Tzit means to see. The Kohen had a tzit on his head. Right? It's the ability to see very deeply. Tzitzit, when they're proper, when they're worn in the correct way, they allow you to be able to see deeper. According to Kabbalah, what is tzitzit? Anybody know? There's a segula that if you struggle in the area of sexuality, you should stare at your tzitzit. Why? Anybody? The tzitzit are the tikkun for the Brit. The tzitzit surrounds you on all sides. The tzitzit are the 613 mitzvot. You're staring at them. And you're realizing right in front of you that there's Hashem, that the Torah exists, that there's a spiritual life that I have. You look at them and you're reminded. And then what ends up happening? Rabbi Nachman says, if a person has good tzitzit, he will find that he gets good advice. Now, on paper, before the lesson, it doesn't really make sense. What's the connection between tzitzit and good advice? But if we understand that advice is like seed, it has to do with sexual union, and tzitzit is the rectification of the Brit, then in reality, if I have tikkun a Brit, then I get good advice. Then, like Yosef, instead of having union with every secular concept and every YouTube video and every YouTube channel and every Netflix whatever, instead I'm having union with Hashem, then as a result of that, I can see very clearly, meaning I can have good advice in my life and always know what to do like Yosef did. Any practical questions? Nobody? Nothing? Does nothing for you? Everybody's good? You guys all knew this stuff already? Yeah.
So when Yosef was the viceroy,
Yeah.
at that time, was the king at that time, the thing that unified them was what exactly?
When Yosef was, they weren't unified.
No, I'm talking about all the Jews came to him.
Oh, I'm saying it's the fact that he was Yesod. There's no way around it. Rabbi Nachman said in the last generation, everybody's going to need me. How did he know that?
Only the guy who is the guy can say that.
What did Yosef say? Same thing. And everybody said, you bugging. And ultimately, what ended up happening? They all came and bowed down, and he said, Ani Yosef. I'm Yosef. But you need to understand that this is not, let's say, Rabbi Nachman or Yosef asserting themselves and saying, I'm something. It's that I know that I have a special koach in the area of Yesod. And that means that ultimately, everything in reality has to come to me. Because that's the Yesod. This is what it does. And by the way, if you're not getting your advice from Yesod, if you're not getting your wisdom and your advice from a real tzaddik, then what ends up happening? You don't give birth to good things in your life. And what's the difficulty or challenge with this is that you won't know until years from now. For example, let's say, for instance, I have a big question. I go to Google Rabbi. Okay? And I ask him, what's going on in my life? I tell him my whole difficulty. And he says, you just need to do this. And even though it might be true, it's not really the truth of truths. And I live according to that truth. Now, I'm not going to know for years that that advice was not good advice. And by the time that I figure it out, I will have already lived with that and have invested in it for a long time. So the challenge and the vulnerability of bad advice is numerous, because bad advice is not just bad in that it's not going to be successful. It's also bad because you won't find out for a while. So what is the key to getting good advice? You need to get it from the Yesod. You need to get it from a real tzaddik. And when you get it from the real tzaddik, even if it doesn't make sense, and the fact that it doesn't, that makes sense, because his advice is not coming from this world. So when he tells you, go talk to Hashem for an hour a day, and you go, but I have to work a job. So you have to understand his advice is not coming from here. And that's the reason why it's so successful. And that's also why it's so hard. Very good, Benny. That's also why it's so hard. But ultimately, you'll see what happens, that just like the tzaddik, ultimately, by you doing these things, even though in the beginning, there's going to be a lot of bitterness, meaning everyone is not going to support you in this. And I know firsthand. And you'll be surprised. Why? Because what am I really doing? I'm literally just trying to live as genuinely as possible with the fact that Hashem exists. And yet, even from religious people, you're going to get a lot of resistance and feedback. It doesn't make any sense. Why? Because Rabbi Nachman says, before peace always comes bitterness. And therefore, the process to ultimately bear fruit, right? You first are challenged. But ultimately, in the end, just like Rav Natan, that his wife told him not to be close to Rabbi Nachman, that his father-in-law told him not to be close to Rabbi Nachman, that his father told him not to be close to Rabbi Nachman, that everybody in his generation told him, do not do this. He is the worst thing in the world. And he literally was almost killed in his lifetime and his students because of this. And what happened at the end? Everybody was modeh to him. His wife said, you were right. His father-in-law said you were right. His father said you were right. But when was that? Only later on. Because the only way to see the truth of advice is later. So if you're saying, but I did an hour of hibodedut, or I tried not wasting seed, or I tried to take this app off my phone, or to put some type of barrier on it, or I tried to do certain things and stop hanging out with certain people, and it's been 1.5 days, and my life didn't completely change. The reason is because advice is like seed, and seed takes 9 months to develop. But you're much better off with good seed that ultimately will give birth to fruit that you can bank on than you are taking the seed and advice from places that are either not true or not completely true or not the truth of truths, and only finding out 5, 10, 15, 20 years later at the end of your life, it was not exactly what you had hoped for. Any other questions? There's a question on the bottom. Assume we receive advice from a stam rabbi. Does doing hibodedut and asking Hashem if above we receive from a non-tzaddik clean the advice or make it the truth of truth? No. Rabbi Nachman says you need to be very, very careful who you ask advice from. And the best bet is to only get your advice from real tzaddikim. Because he says anybody else, even if they're an amazing person, even if they're on the head of Time magazine as humanitarian of the year, even if it looks like they have achieved every level of success that you can imagine, and therefore you respect this person, you revere this person, whatever. So he says, Rabbi Nachman says, advice, just like seed, draws down every bit of that person. So for instance, let's say that person is 99% on the up and up, and he has one little hidden part of him that is very, very, very egotistical, or is very, very, very infatuated with women, or is very, very, very interested in having everybody's money, but you don't know it. That little tiny thing gets in every piece of his advice, just like seed gathers from every bit of the person. And therefore, and this is even the greater risk, is that because the advice is going to look 99% good, but in the end, the only thing that bears fruit is something that's completely true. Because the whole concept of sheker, or a lie, is it's temporarily successful and then it goes away. Just like all the other nations of the world, that they come up very, very strong and powerful. It looks like, oh my gosh, this is it. America, this is it. Greece, this is it. Rome, this is it. Babylonia, this is it. And if you'd say it's not it, this is going to be gone in a few years, they would say you're insane. What world are you living in? And ultimately it goes away. Why? Because it's not real. And the harder it comes up and it's not real, the harder it falls. But what's the whole essence of truth? That it's always true. And in the end, it bears fruit. It's not sterile. And by the way, just this goes all the way back to Abraham. That when Abraham first started to teach people about Hashem and about Amunah, everybody told him, literally in his generation, that you're a sterile mule. What does it mean that you're a sterile mule? A mule can't give birth to children because it's a crossbreed. So when they try and mate it with another animal, nothing comes from it. It's sterile now. They were saying to Abraham, this whole new idea, Hashem Echad, that gods are not many, that there's only one, and he's not even physical, he's invisible, and that he's everywhere, and that he loves you. They said, what are you talking about? You think really people are going to connect to this idea? You think people are going to attach to this? You think that this is going to catch on? And they called him a sterile mule. Ultimately, what ended up happening? He gave birth to the whole world. He gave birth to the whole world. Now, on paper, if you look at the situation and you see everyone says not like him, who would you put your poker chips with? You put it with the majority, no? 99% of the world says you're crazy. One person has a new idea. Sounds good. A little fanatical. A little religious. But ultimately, what ended up happening? Nobody in the world believes in multiple gods now. Pretty much. It's like gone. And the majority of the world either believes in one God or no God. Okay.
Can I ask a follow-up question?
Yes.
Yeah. So, I mean, the idea that the whole world is created for each one of us, and that everything we hear is from Hashem. And so we're getting this advice from somebody, some random rabbi, and then how do we differentiate? I mean, it's from Hashem technically. So how could you not take that advice, or at least use it?
Right. So there's two different ways to get advice. One way is someone just comes and gives it to me. And another way is that I go and ask for it. Right. According to Rabbi Nachman, you need to be careful who you go and get advice from. But let's say in the course of a day, someone just comes and gives you Eitzah. So just because Hashem is sending you a message doesn't mean that the message he's sending you is that the advice is good advice that you just got. I mean, if you were every single day, if you thought that listening to Hashem meant that everything that you heard was true from everybody, so your life would be tohu vavohu, it would be chaos. The fact that everything is a message from Hashem doesn't mean that Hashem wants you to do that thing. Like if a person says to me, yeah, you told me everything is from Hashem and I got a pop-up from this website, okay? So just because Hashem gave you a challenge or an obstacle, it doesn't mean he wants you to press yes. Don't laugh too much. You give your stuff away over here. Anybody else? Oh, we got a question down here. How can we know who is a true tzaddik, and do we have one today? We have one that I know of, and I know that there's more, but the only one I can vouch for, his name is Rabbi Nachman, and even though he's not physically alive, his advice and his wisdom is as alive as ever, and it works as much or more than ever. So, are there others? Yes, there have been in history. Will I on camera vouch for it when this is going to be watched by people, and then people will take this advice and try to live with it. No. Yes. Great question. So this is a little bit of the challenge with the way that people perceive Breslov Hasidus. That is that it's the only Hasidus in the world, even though there are so many different expressions of Hasidus and different dynasties and different Rebbes. The only one that never had another Rebbe after the first one is Breslov. Why is it that Rabbi Nachman didn't anoint a successor? Why isn't that this is the only form that doesn't have another rabbi? And why is it that it's the one that's picking up the most steam at the end of history? The reason is because Rabbi Nachman did not believe in culture. He didn't believe that just because we have a, so to speak, a Hasidic dynasty, that now if I have a child, he's now going to be a tremendous tzaddik who could lead a whole generation. Why is that a guarantee? Doesn't really make any sense either. So even though Rabbi Nachman was flamed for this in his lifetime, and ever since then, he said there will not be another one after me. Okay? So now, how do I get advice from Rabbi Nachman if he's not physically here? And the answer is you get it from his students. Now, if you want to make sure you're getting the best advice from his students, then you for sure need to pray in your Hibodedut, Hashem, please help me to connect to those people who are genuinely, authentically trying to live with his teachings and have nothing of their own. The most important thing that you have when you go to get advice from anybody is that it's not about them. If you go to a person and his advice has anything to do with his own self-benefit, you are in trouble. How many people do you know that are like that? There's not many of them. So you need to ask Hashem every day, like Rabbi Nachman says, the Rav Natan says, Hashem, please keep me away from bad advice. Hashem, please help me only get good advice. He says every day you should pray for this. Because what ends up happening, your whole life is based on advice. Yeah.
So, the way I understand, and I'm sure you can imagine this, the Nachman's whole idea of the world is that you can be above the world, correct? Correct me if I'm wrong.
He says you're made for that. You're created for that. That you should be above this physical world while you live in it.
Okay. And then, for example, we have a Gemara that we learn. And the Gemara says certain things that people are bound by time, space, and matter. And that they live their life according to a certain era, the temple, you know what I'm saying? So what I'm asking is, let's say I'm learning that in yeshiva setting, in Kola, for example, or just yeshiva, and we learn that. Is that in a way intertwined with how I want to live my life according to Nachman, and then at the same time you have the laws that everyone in the Gemara live their life according to
I understand.
set rules, you know what I mean?
Right. So the first thing is, there's nothing that Rabbi Nachman says that contradicts the Gemara. So everybody needs to know that, because for some reason there's reputation that Rabbi Nachman made up his own Torah, and it doesn't fit with Chazal. Everything that he says comes from Chazal. Now, why is it that Rabbi Nachman's wisdom, though, is so unique and different? The reason is because as time goes on, it's explained in Kabbalah, the further we get away from, let's say, Har Sinai, the closer we get to Mashiach, the further we get as generations, the greater light that we need, the greater revelation of godliness that we need. So why is it that the Zohar doesn't come out until 1,000 years after it's written, 1,500 years after it's written? Because those generations didn't need it. But ultimately, when we got very far from Har Sinai, we got very far from spirituality, we need a greater light now. Now comes a little bit further, you have a couple hundred years later, and we're even further now from that original spiritual state we were in. Now we need an even greater light. Comes the Baal Shem Tov. And now, 100 years later again, we're in an even further state. And even in the state of Chassidus, it was nothing like it was when the Baal Shem Tov had created it. And comes along Rabbi Nachman. So if you want to know how could it be that these things are new or innovative, the reason is because Hashem reveals more innovative lights, deeper penetrations of reality, different ways of thinking or higher consciousness as time goes on in order to combat the darkness of the world which fills it. Okay, let me just see if anybody else has a question. Yes, go ahead, Benny.
This concept of the Tzaddik Yisrael Olam,
Yes,
I'm sure you and I already understand it, but
I'm still working on it. Yeah, go ahead.
is there still a physical manifestation of the concept of Tzaddik Yisrael Olam in our generation right now?
Yes,
A physical human being,
yes,
and we have no idea what it is yet.
no. Rabbi Nachman says, the question is, why is it ending with Rabbi Nachman? Meaning, it sounds like from our whole class, there's always a yesod. So seemingly there should be a yesod now. The answer is that there is. Is there a tzaddik yesod olam in our generation? There is. Do we know who it is? Maybe, maybe not. Okay? But whoever that person is, there's also a very good chance he's the Mashiach. Because Rabbi Nachman says ultimately, the final manifestation of the tzaddik yesod olam is the Redeemer. So you should pray very, very much to find whoever that is. And Bezrat Hashem should help us find it. Any last questions before we finish? He can certainly be about tshuva, and I have a sneaking suspicion he might be. What's the reason for that? I'll just tell you because I was thinking about this before. Question was, is there a chance he's about tshuva? There's a very good chance he's about tshuva. Rabbi Nachman said a couple of very interesting things. First thing he said is that when Mashiach comes to the world, his parents are going to be eh. What does eh mean? How do you say in Bukharian? That's how you say it also? Oh, okay. Meaning that his parents are going to be like, spiritually. Very interesting statement. Now, wouldn't you think the Mashiach's parents would be the most chashuv, most spiritually elevated people? And yet Rabbi Nachman teaches, in fact, and it's a very interesting statement, that Mashiach's parents will be Okay? Now, there is a nevuah, there's a prophecy that at the end of time, trying to think about the terminology. The staff of Yosef, or Ephraim, the staff of Ephraim is going to become one with the staff of Yehuda. What is this speaking about? So it's talking about how at the end, ultimately, the tzaddik yesod olam is not just yesod, he's also malchut. Meaning that Yehuda and Yosef come together in the end. The Lubavitcher Rebbe used to say when they asked him, is Mashiach ben Yosef and Mashiach ben David, are they two different people? Are they one person? What's the deal? So he said, if we married it, it'll be one person. And that would mean what? That he is both a tzaddik and a Baal Tshuva. Because the Malchut is the Baal Tshuva, this is David, and the tzaddik is Yosef, right? And ultimately these two things come together, and this is what makes him so powerful. Because he has the same level of righteousness as a person who's born religious, and at the same time, he has a koach in being able to connect to those people in his generation, specifically through speech, in a way that a person who otherwise would not be able to. And through these two things together, the staff of Ephraim and the staff of Yehuda come together as one. This is Mashiach. Yeah.
I remember learning a 12 with you prior to this class about how the tzaddik takes certain things and he encloses it. Like, for example, the sun is too overbearing for us. We
Right.
can't look at it. We need glasses.
Right.
We need shade. So, is him, quote unquote, sinning a covering for his deep light?
Benny asked, is the fact that David, who's the Malchut, the Mashiach, the king, he is known for the fact that he had a tremendous error in his life, and he did teshuvah, and he ended up becoming the king of the Jewish people, and as well, Yehuda himself did the same thing. So you see it's in the lineage of the house of David, this concept of I make tremendous errors in my life, or I have tremendous lackings or failings, and ultimately, this is actually what leads to my success. So he's saying, like this, we know that there's a concept that sometimes when a light is too great, it needs to be hidden or concealed in us to be able to enjoy it or have from it. So Benny said, could it be that with Mashiach as well, because he's such a great light, originally he might have to do something which is not considered so kosher. And ultimately, as a result of that, it hides his light, but then he's able to reveal that later on. So actually, it's interesting you say that, because it's taught in Kabbalah that every soul that comes down to this world needs haskama from Satan. Every neshama that comes down into this world needs haskama, needs approval from all of the entities which exist above, including the one who is constantly interrogating us and trying to cause us to fall. They call him Satan or the Baal Dever. Now, when very great souls come into the world, it's said that he will not agree to it unless he doesn't think that they're going to be able to actually ultimately manifest that light. And it's taught about Mashiach, or the soul of David, that the only reason he let him into the world is because he would give him circumstances in his life that were not possible to overcome. And because of that, and only because of that, he felt comfortable bringing him into the world. And ultimately, the koach of David, or Mashiach, is that he is actually stronger than circumstances that you can't overcome. And as a result of that, this soul is able to end up coming up and out over all of it. And because he's hidden as a child, but later on manifests his light, this is the whole reason the Mashiach is able to work, because there's no way for the light of Mashiach to be born into the world just stam, because the Satan would never let that happen. But if he thinks he's not going to make it, or the odds are really stacked up against him, then that's the case. And also, you should know, Rabbi Nachman says that that the key to the Geula is hidden Torah. Where is all the hidden Torah located? So Rabbi Nachman has an unbelievable thing. He says that hidden Torah is in the souls of Bali Tshuva. That all of the mystical hidden Torah is actually deeply embedded within all of those Jewish people who are very far from Hashem. Now, the same thing could be said here collectively, because we know that the generation of Mashiach has to be like Mashiach himself. Then maybe the reason why we're all so far in a very paradoxical way is because we're holding on to something very, very hidden. Okay, in Bezrat Hashem, we're all going to be able to find out what that is. Only if this is not apocalyptic. You have something to say that's not apocalyptic or world ending? Okay, good.
My middle name is Hananiah. One of the names of the Messiah. What happens then?
We will all see. Bezrat Hashem.
Name change. My mom did change my middle name to Chaim. It's still Chad
Bezrat Hashem, whoever it is, he should come really, really, really quickly, because we need him very much. Okay, we're tired of eating gefilte fish. I just want to give you guys the schedule for the rest of the week, okay? Tuesday night, we have our Likutei Moharan class. You should not miss that class. It's an unbelievable class just for men, but women can watch it online on Zoom. Or if you're not local, you can watch it on Zoom. And I believe Thursday night, I was actually asked, there's apparently, it's connected to the class tonight, there's some type of Tikkun Brit program, Shovavim, that was started. Apparently tonight is the first night that they're doing it, and Rabbi Yosef Mizrahi is their first speaker. They asked me to come and speak on Thursday night. So for anybody who wants to come, and it would be good just to get the Tzion guys there. We're going to have a flyer. We're going to send it out. So we're going to have a Thursday night class in addition to the Sunday and Tuesday we usually do. It's going to be probably in a different location under a different auspice. I would love if you guys came and supported the crew, and also obviously learned a little bit more about what we need to do to accomplish Tikkun in this area. Okay? Everybody have an amazing, amazing week.